The mortar and pestle made no sound as Josiah ground the oleander roots into powder finer than ash. His hands, calloused from 27 years of labor that began before he could walk, moved with the precision of a man who had already died inside. The pre-dawn kitchen of Bellefonte Plantation breathed around him, copper pots catching firelight like the scales of sleeping dragons, cast iron stoves exhaling heat that made the air shimmer and dance. He worked in shadow, in the space between the dying night and the blood-red promise of morning, and with each rotation of the pestle, he pulverized not just roots but the last remnants of his soul. The white powder accumulated in the mortar's bowl. Beautiful, really. Delicate as snow, innocent as baptismal salt. Josiah had learned about oleander from old Ruth, the root woman who'd been sold away 2 winters past for knowing too much about plants that healed and plants that killed. She'd shown him the pink blossoms that grew wild near the creek, warned him never to burn the wood for cooking, never to let the children play near the branches. Everything pretty got poison in it, she'd told him, her ancient eyes holding knowledge that predated the chains. God's way of balance. Balance. The word tasted like iron in his mouth. Behind him, the kitchen had begun its morning resurrection. Bessie emerged from the servants' quarters, her head wrap already damp with sweat though the day had barely broken. She moved to the bread ovens without a word, her silence a survival instinct honed sharp as razors. Then came Moses and little Samuel, the latter barely 12 but already broken to the rhythm of endless labor. They hauled water from the well, their bare feet slapping against wooden floors worn smooth by generations of the enslaved. Josiah worked unseen in his corner, his body angled to shield his work. The kitchen was a cathedral of suffering and sustenance, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows where hooks held dried herbs and cured meats. The scent of rosemary and thyme mingled with the ever-present smell of wood smoke and human fear. This was the heart of Bellefonte, where the grandeur of the big house was forged through burning hands and breaking backs. Today was to be the grandest wedding Charleston County had witnessed in a decade. Today, Josiah would marry Delilah. Today, 19 people will die. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the terrible weight of choice. For the first time in his life, Josiah held power in his palms. The white powder gleamed in the firelight, and he felt something he'd thought beaten out of him years ago, agency. The ability to act rather than be acted upon. It was intoxicating and horrifying in equal measure. 3 nights ago. The memory crashed over him like a wave, and his hands stilled. He'd been returning from the stables where he'd been checking on a mare in foal. The path took him past the smokehouse, and that's when he'd heard it, a sound that would replay in his mind until his dying day. Weeping. Delilah's weeping, raw and broken, the kind of crying that comes from a place beyond tears. He'd found her in the darkness, her dress torn at the shoulder, her eyes vacant as a corpse's. She wouldn't speak. Couldn't speak. Just shook her head when he asked who'd done this, though they both knew. I had always known. Master Thaddeus Merrick, patriarch of Bellefonte, pillar of Charleston society, deacon of the Baptist church, had been violating Delilah for months. And the marriage, this farce of a wedding ceremony, was his idea. Entertainment for his guests. A display of his benevolence, allowing 2 of his chattel to marry in a Christian ceremony. The cruelty was breathtaking in its elegance. He says if I tell anyone, he'll sell me to the Rawlings plantation, Delilah had whispered finally, her voice scraping raw. You know what they do to women there, Josiah. You know. He knew. Everyone knew. The Rawlings plantation in the Georgia Lowcountry was where difficult slaves were sent to be broken. Women who went there came back empty, if they came back at all. Josiah had held her in the darkness of the smokehouse, surrounded by hanging hams and the ghost scent of hickory, and felt something inside him crack. Not break, he'd been broken long ago. This was different. This was a crack that let something out. Something that had been trapped and compressed for 27 years. Rage. Pure, distilled, apocalyptic rage. Return to the present. The crystal decanters stood in a row before him now, filled with punch, a concoction of rum, brandy, citrus, and spices that would serve the wedding guests throughout the day's festivities. He'd prepared the punch himself, a task assigned because Master Thaddeus enjoyed watching his slaves serve poison to themselves in the form of labor. The irony was not lost on Josiah. His hands moved with surgical precision. A pinch of the powder into the first decanter. Then the second. The third. He used the silver stirring rod, real silver, because Master Thaddeus spared no expense, to dissolve the poison. The powder vanished into the amber liquid like sins into baptismal water, leaving no trace, no evidence. The oleander's cardiac glycosides would take 30 minutes to work their way through blood and bone, to seize hearts and still lungs. 30 minutes of laughter and celebration before the screaming began. Outside, the Carolina dawn broke red as arterial blood. Josiah carried the decanters through the breezeway that connected the kitchen to the main house, his bare feet silent on wooden boards still cool from the night. The air smelled of jasmine and the salt tang of the Atlantic, 10 miles distant but ever present in the low-country humidity. Mist rose from the rice fields where enslaved men and women were already at work, their backs bent to the water, their songs floating across the flooded paddies like the ghosts of everything they'd lost. The ballroom made him stop at its threshold. He'd been inside the big house countless times, but never when it looked like this. White magnolias dripped from the chandeliers, their waxy petals perfect and funeral bright. Garlands of ivy wrapped the columns. The wooden floors gleamed with fresh polish applied by hands that would never attend the celebration. Tables laden with silver and crystal stretched along one wall, waiting for food that could feed every enslaved person on Bellefonte for a month. The room was beautiful in the way that graveyards are beautiful, peaceful and terrible and entirely indifferent to human suffering. Josiah placed the decanters on the main table. His reflection rippled in the polished silver, distorted and unrecognizable. Was this him? This man capable of murder? He'd killed before, a chicken with a twisted neck, a hog with a knife, but never a human. Never 19 humans. But were they human? The question clawed at him. Master Thaddeus had looked him in the eye 1,000 times and seen property. Mrs. Constance Merrick had smiled sweetly while selling children away from their mothers. The guests who would arrive within the hour had built their fortunes on buying and selling human flesh. They drank wine from goblets polished by hands they owned. They slept in beds made by hands they owned. They ate food prepared by hand. And they would drink punches poisoned by hands they thought they owned. Josiah. The voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. He turned to find Delilah standing in the doorway, and the sight of her nearly undid him. She wore white, a mockery of virginity, of purity, a simple cotton dress that had been laundered until it gleamed. Her hair was wrapped in a cream-colored cloth. Her eyes, dark as Carolina soil, held an emptiness that terrified him more than any punishment could. "It's time," she said. Her voice was flat, mechanical. The voice of someone who'd fled their own body and left only a shell behind. He wanted to tell her. Wanted to grab her shoulders and shake her back to life and tell her that by midday, Master Thaddeus would be dead. That they'd all be dead. That there would be justice, however brutal, however fleeting. But the words caught in his throat like fishhooks. "I know," he said instead. The sound of carriage wheels on the oyster shell drive drifted through the open windows. Laughter followed, high, crystalline, the sound of people who'd never known fear. The guests were arriving. Charleston's finest, come to witness the marriage of two slaves, come to drink and feast and congratulate themselves on their civilized benevolence. Come to die. Josiah moved to the window and watched the first carriage roll to a stop before the portico. A couple emerged, the man portly and red-faced, the woman cinched into her corset until her waist looked broken. They laughed at something, their mouths wide with mirth, and the sound echoed across the misty grounds like the cackle of carrion birds circling a battlefield. More carriages followed. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, turning the sky the color of old blood. In the distance, a crow called 3 times, an omen, old Ruth would have said. An omen of death. Josiah pressed his palm against the cool glass of the window and watched the guests arrive in their silks and their certainties. His hand left a print on the glass, proof that he existed, that he was here, that he mattered. By sunset, that handprint would be all that remained of this moment, this choice, this terrible dawn when a man with nothing to lose decided that if he was damned, he would not be damned alone. The crimson sun rose higher, and Bellefonte Plantation stirred to life, unaware that it was waking to its own funeral. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre horror stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, I read them all. They arrived like vultures dressed in silk, their carriages rolling up the circular drive with the inevitability of a funeral procession. From his position in the servants' alcove behind the ballroom, Josiah watched them emerge into the late morning heat, their faces flushed with anticipation, their voices carrying the casual confidence of people who had never once questioned their right to exist at the expense of others. Master Thaddeus Merrick stood at the portico to greet them, silver-haired and serpentine in his movements, his pale blue eyes glittering with something that might have been pleasure if snakes could feel such things. At 63, he remained straight-backed and vigorous, his body not yet betraying the rot that festered in his soul. He wore a coat of dove-gray silk, a waistcoat embroidered with gold thread, and a cravat so white it hurt to look at. His hands, soft, uncalloused, the hands of a man who had never worked a day in his life, gestured expansively as he welcomed his guests. "Virgil. Prudence. How good of you to come." His voice carried the honeyed drawl of Charleston aristocracy, each syllable rounded and deliberate. Virgil Ashford stumbled slightly as he descended from his carriage, already drunk though the sun had barely reached its zenith. He was a broad-shouldered man gone to fat, his neck straining against his collar, his face perpetually ruddy from bourbon and rage. He owned the neighboring plantation, Ashford Oaks, where conditions were said to be even worse than at Bellefonte, a claim Josiah had once thought impossible until he'd met survivors. "Wouldn't miss it, Thaddeus." Virgil boomed, clasping Master Thaddeus's hand with enough force to make a lesser man wince. "Heard you're finally breeding that pretty house girl. Smart investment. Her offspring should fetch a fine price." Josiah's stomach turned. They spoke of Delilah as one might discuss livestock. Prudence Ashford followed her husband with the careful steps of a woman who had learned to navigate a life of quiet suffering. She was thin to the point of fragility, her collarbone jutting beneath pale skin, her eyes holding the glazed distance of someone who survived by not being fully present. She wore lavender silk that whispered against the ground, and her smile never reached her eyes. She'd borne Virgil 4 children, 3 had survived. She'd learned not to flinch when he raised his hand. Behind them came the Blackwells. Cornelius Blackwell was a politician with presidential ambitions, though his dreams would die here today, unmourned and unremembered. He was tall and distinguished, with iron-gray hair swept back from a high forehead and a kind of commanding presence that made men listen when he spoke. He'd made his fortune in cotton and expanded it through strategic marriages. The first wife had died conveniently young, leaving him free to wed Evangeline, who was young enough to be his daughter and knew it. Evangeline Blackwell moved with the careful grace of a woman who understood she was properly dressed in finery. At 28, she was still beautiful, with dark hair piled high and a waist cinched so tight she could barely breathe. She smiled at all the right moments and said all the right things, and her eyes held the same emptiness as Delilah's. Different cages, Josiah thought. Same prison. "Thaddeus, you old scoundrel." Cornelius's voice boomed across the portico. "I hear your man makes the finest punch in the Lowcountry. I've been dreaming of it since your invitation arrived." Master Thaddeus smiled, and Josiah felt ice crawl down his spine. "You won't be disappointed, Cornelius. I guarantee it." More carriages arrived in steady succession. Silas Pemberton emerged from a gilt-edged monstrosity, his bulk requiring assistance from his footman. He'd grown fat on the slave trade, literally fat, his body swollen with the profits of human misery. He dealt primarily in fancy girls, light-skinned women sold for purposes no one spoke of in polite company but everyone understood. His fingers were covered in rings that caught the sunlight, each one worth more than every enslaved person at Bellefonte combined. His wife, Mercy Pemberton, followed him with a Bible clutched to her chest and a smile that could curdle milk. She was pious in the way that only the truly cruel can be, her faith a bludgeon she wielded against anyone who failed to meet her exacting standards. She ran the Ladies' Missionary Society and believed firmly that slavery was God's will, that suffering built character in the African race, that they should be grateful for Christian salvation even if it came wrapped in chains. "Blessed be this union," she proclaimed to no one in particular, her voice shrill as a harpy's cry. "May these servants be fruitful and multiply for the glory of their masters." Josiah's hands clenched into fists. Old Ruth's voice echoed in his memory, "Everything pretty got poison in it." Judge Ambrose Whitmore arrived next, ancient and deaf, assisted by his sister Octavia. The judge was 77 years old and had spent 4 decades on the bench ensuring that the peculiar institution remained protected by law. He'd sentenced runaway slaves to death, had ruled that enslaved people could not testify against whites, had upheld every cruel statute that transformed human beings into property. Now he was confused more often than not, his mind wandering through memories that held no remorse. Octavia Whitmore was sharp where her brother was dull, her tongue a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. At 65, she wore black bombazine despite the heat, still mourning a husband who died 20 years prior and whom she'd hated every day of their marriage. She surveyed Bellefonte with critical eyes, no doubt cataloguing every perceived imperfection to discuss later over tea. "Ambrose, mind the step," she commanded, steering her brother with the efficiency of long practice. The judge nodded amiably, smiling at everyone and no one, lost in a past only he could see. Dr. Beauregard Hayes arrived in a carriage that had seen better days, his medical practice slowly crumbling as his addiction to opium grew. He was gaunt, hollow-eyed, his hands possessing a tremor he tried to hide by keeping them clasped behind his back. He'd been a respected physician once, before the war with Mexico, before he discovered that laudanum could silence the screams of men dying on surgical tables. Now he was a ghost haunting his own life, present but not present, seeing but not seeing. His wife, Rowena Hayes, descended from the carriage with barely concealed eagerness. She wore crimson, inappropriate for a married woman, but she no longer cared about propriety. She was conducting an affair with a rice factor from Charleston, and everyone knew it except her husband, who knew it but pretended not to. Her eyes scanned the crowd, perhaps hoping her lover would appear, though he had not been invited. The younger guests arrived in a flurry of excitement. Lieutenant Gideon Talmadge, resplendent in his military uniform, was Master Thaddeus's nephew, the son of his deceased sister. At 29, he was handsome in the way that young men in uniform always are, his future bright with promise and violence. He'd fought the Seminoles in Florida, had burned villages and driven families into swamps, and wore his brutality like a badge of honor. With him came Henrietta Vale, a Charleston debutante seeking a wealthy match. She was 23 and beautiful, with blonde ringlets and a smile practiced before mirrors. She laughed too loudly at Lieutenant Talmadge's jokes, touched his arm with calculated casualness, and calculated the worth of every man in the room with the precision of an accountant. She would die wealthy or die trying, though today, she would simply die. They gathered in the ballroom, a collection of Charleston's finest, their voices rising in a cacophony of greetings and gossip. Enslaved servants moved among them like shadows, offering refreshments, taking wraps, invisible until needed. Josiah watched a young woman, Sarah, barely 16, navigate the crowd with a tray of canapes. Virgil Ashford's hand brushed her hip as she passed, and she flinched but did not cry out. Could not cry out. The punch sat waiting on the main table, crystal decanters catching the light streaming through tall windows, the liquid inside gleaming like amber, like honey, like promise. No one had tasted it yet. They were waiting for the ceremony, for the proper moment to raise their glasses in toast. Reverend Ezekiel Stone arrived last, a lean vulture of a man who served God and mammon with equal fervor. He wore black despite the heat, his Bible bound in leather that had once been the skin of something living. He greeted Master Thaddeus with unctuous familiarity, having baptized every Merrick child for 3 generations and having never once questioned the institution that paid for his comfortable parsonage. "A blessed day," he intoned, his voice like gravel in a collection plate. "Truly blessed, to see these servants joined in holy matrimony under Christian guidance." Constance Merrick, who had been supervising the final arrangements with the desperate energy of a woman trying to ignore her husband's sins, clasped her hands together in delight. She was 54 years old and had spent 30 of those years perfecting the art of willful blindness. She knew what her husband did to the enslaved women under his control. She knew, and she looked away because looking directly at truth would shatter the crystal palace of her life. She wore mint green silk and pearls, and her smile was fragile as old porcelain. "Isn't it wonderful?" she said to anyone who would listen. "We treat our people so well here at Bellefonte. Like family, truly like family." Josiah felt bile rise in his throat. Like family. He thought of Delilah's torn dress, her empty eyes, her whispered fear of being sold away. Like family. The guests assembled in rows facing the improvised altar, a table draped in white linen, adorned with magnolias that would be brown and dead by morning. Josiah was led to stand before them, feeling their eyes crawl over his skin like insects. He wore new clothes, purchased for this occasion, dark trousers, a white shirt, a vest. He was properly dressed up to play human for their entertainment. Then Delilah appeared, and the room fell silent. She moved like a ghost, her white dress catching the light, her face a beautiful mask hiding unfathomable pain. Bessie had woven flowers into her hair, Cherokee roses, white and perfect and doomed to wilt. She did not look at Josiah as she took her place beside him. She looked at nothing, at no one, her soul having fled to some safer place where Master's hands could not reach. Reverend Stone opened his Bible with ceremonial gravity. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice filling the ballroom with false sanctity, "we are gathered here to join these two servants in holy matrimony. Let us remember the words of Ephesians, servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the singleness of your heart, as unto Christ." The guests nodded approvingly. Scripture weaponized, used to sanctify the unsanctifiable. The ceremony proceeded with dreamlike horror. Josiah heard his own voice respond when prompted, and heard Delilah's whisper soft answers. He slipped a twisted wire ring onto her finger, it was all he could make, all he was allowed to possess. She did not look at him. Could not look at him. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Stone declared, closing his Bible with a sound like thunder. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." But they were not joined by God. They were joined by chains, by cruelty, by a system that allowed men like Thaddeus Merrick to play at benevolence while committing atrocities. The guests applauded politely. Then Master Thaddeus stepped forward, his silver hair gleaming in the afternoon light. He gestured to the servants who stood ready by the punch table. They began filling crystal cups, the poisoned liquid flowing like a river of gold, like a river of judgment. Master Thaddeus took the first cup, raised it high so that light shone through the amber liquid. His eyes found Josiah across the room, and he smiled, a smile that held ownership, possession, the absolute certainty of power. To the happy couple, he proclaimed, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "May they be fruitful and multiply, and may their offspring serve Bellefonte for generations to come." The guests laughed, reached for their cups, raised them in perfect unison. And Josiah watched, his heart pounding like a drum calling the faithful to witness, as 19 people lifted poison to their lips and drank deep of their own damnation. The first sip was a communion of the damned. Master Thaddeus drank deep, his throat working as the poison punch slid down, and his eyes widened with genuine pleasure. "Magnificent," he declared, examining the crystal cup as though it held liquid gold. "Josiah, you've outdone yourself. There's something different about it today. A floral note. Almost like perfume." The guests murmured agreement, raising their own cups to their lips. Josiah watched from his position against the far wall, his body rigid as carved wood, his soul fracturing with each swallow they took. The oleander's sweetness was unmistakable once you knew to look for it, that faint, cloying perfume that spoke of gardens and death intertwined. Cornelius Blackwell smacked his lips appreciatively. "Exquisite, Thaddeus. Truly exquisite. You must give me the recipe." He drained his cup and immediately reached for another from a passing servant's tray. "Recipe," Josiah thought, a hysterical laugh building in his chest like a scream. 1 part rum, 2 parts brandy, citrus to taste, and enough cardiac glycosides to stop a human heart. "It's divine," Evangeline Blackwell added, her voice soft but carrying in the momentary lull. She took another sip, more delicate than her husband, but a sip nonetheless. The poison entered her bloodstream, began its microscopic journey through vessels and organs, a silent invader that would announce itself only when escape was impossible. Mercy Pemberton pursed her lips after tasting. "Perhaps a touch sweet for my palate, but well-crafted nonetheless. The Lord has blessed you with talented servants, Thaddeus. The Lord has blessed you." The words echoed in Josiah's mind, colliding with memories that rose unbidden like corpses from flooded graves. He was 7 years old, standing on an auction block in Charleston, his mother's hand torn from his as a man in a fine coat, not unlike the ones worn by the guests here today, counted out coins. His mother screamed his name until her voice broke, and he watched her dragged away while the auctioneer's voice droned on about his teeth, his limbs, his potential for labor. He never saw her again. Never learned if she lived or died. She simply ceased to exist in his world, erased as thoroughly as if she'd never been born. "The Lord has blessed you with talented servants." He was 14, his back pressed against the whipping post, the overseer's lash singing through the air. 20 strokes for the crime of learning to read. Master Thaddeus had watched from the veranda, sipping lemonade in the shade, and when it was done he nodded approvingly. Best to break that habit early, he'd said to his guest, a man Josiah didn't recognize. Education makes them uppity. His voice had been conversational, pleasant, as though discussing the weather or the price of rice. The Lord has blessed you. 3 nights ago, finding Delilah in the smokehouse, her dress torn, her spirit shattered. He says it's his right, she'd whispered, her voice raw from crying. Says I should be grateful he chose me. Says if I tell anyone, if I resist, he'll sell me to the Rawlings place in Georgia. You know what they do there, Josiah. You know. He knew. Everyone knew. The Rawlings plantation was where difficult slaves were sent to be destroyed, women used until they broke, men worked until they died, children sold before they could remember their parents' faces. Blessed. The toasts continued, a cascade of congratulations and casual cruelty wrapped in silk phrases. To Josiah and Delilah, Virgil Ashford bellowed, already pouring himself a 3rd cup. May they produce strong sons and comely daughters to serve Bellefonte for generations. He winked at Master Thaddeus. And may the first child have your eyes, Thaddeus. I've noticed your particular interest in the bride. The men laughed, a sound like dogs barking, while the women were affected not to hear. Delilah stood beside Josiah, her hand cold in his, her face a mask of blank endurance. She had not touched the punch. Neither had he. They alone remained unpoisoned, witnesses to the last moments of health that these people would ever know. The grandfather clock in the corner marked time with inexorable precision. 27 minutes until the first symptoms would manifest. 27 minutes of normalcy before the screaming began. Judge Ambrose Whitmore had cornered Cornelius Blackwell near the punch table, his ancient voice rising and falling in a story everyone had heard a dozen times before. Valley Forge, winter of '78, he was saying, his deaf ears preventing him from noticing Cornelius's glazed expression. Washington himself commended my regiment. Coldest winter in memory. Lost 3 toes to frostbite, you know. He gestured with his cup, sloshing punch onto the polished floor. Of course, that was nothing compared to the Battle of Brandywine. Cornelius drank deeply, perhaps hoping the alcohol would make the story more bearable. He would never hear the end of it. By the time Judge Whitmore reached the conclusion, something about stolen boots and a Hessian's hat, Cornelius would be on the floor, his heart seizing in his chest. Across the room, Lieutenant Gideon Talmadge had maneuvered Henrietta Vale into a corner near the magnolia-draped windows. He stood too close, his uniform pressed and his smile predatory. I ship out for the Western Territories next month, he was saying, his chest puffed with self-importance. There's talk of trouble with the Comanche. It should be a splendid sport. Henrietta laughed, a practiced tinkle of sound, and touched his arm with calculated precision. How brave you are, Lieutenant. I confess, I find military men terribly romantic. Do you? He leaned closer, his breath heavy with punch and promise. Perhaps you'd do me the honor of a dance? I may not return from the frontier, you know. Best to make memories while we can. She accepted, her mind already calculating the worth of a military widow's pension versus the uncertainty of a lieutenant's survival. They moved to the center of the ballroom where other couples had begun to dance, their bodies swaying to music played by enslaved musicians who knew better than to let their exhaustion show. Dr. Beauregard Hayes had slipped away to a quiet corner, his medical bag clutched like a talisman. Josiah watched him extract a small brown bottle, laudanum, and take a long swallow directly from it. The doctor's hands trembled as he replaced the bottle, his eyes distant and glassy. He'd already consumed 2 cups of punch. The combination of opium and oleander would make his death particularly agonizing, his body unable to process either poison effectively. His wife, Rowena, pretended not to notice her husband's addiction. She was dancing with Silas Pemberton, her crimson dress swirling as he spun her with surprising grace for a man of his bulk. She laughed at something he said, her head thrown back, and for a moment she looked genuinely happy. It would be the last happiness she ever felt. I wager I can drink you under the table, Pemberton. Virgil Ashford's voice boomed across the ballroom, alcohol making him louder and more belligerent. 5 cups to your 3, I've already got a head start. Silas laughed, his jowls shaking. I've drunk sailors under the table in port cities from Havana to Liverpool, Ashford. You're on. They proceeded to make a contest of it, downing cup after cup of the poisoned punch while their wives watched with varying degrees of disapproval. Mercy Pemberton clutched her Bible tighter, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or judgment. Prudence Ashford simply looked away, her thin shoulders hunched as though trying to make herself disappear. The ballroom had become a tableau of final moments, a painting of humanity in its last hours of ignorance. The chandeliers blazed with candlelight, casting shadows that danced across walls papered in silk damask. The magnolias dripped their white petals onto polished floors. The music played, a waltz that seemed to come from very far away, as though filtering through water or dreams. Outside, the sky had darkened. Storm clouds rolled in from the Atlantic, purple-black and pregnant with rain. The air thickened with moisture, pressing against windows like something trying to get in. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks, swaying in the rising wind, looking for all the world like nooses prepared for an execution. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a sound like God clearing his throat. Josiah's eyes found the clock again. 15 minutes had passed. 15 more until the reckoning. He looked at Delilah, and found her already looking at him. In her eyes, he saw a question she dared not ask aloud: "What have you done?" He could not answer. Not here. Not now. So he simply held her gaze, trying to communicate everything, his rage, his love, his desperation, his damnation, in that single look. She must have understood something, because her eyes widened and her grip on his hand tightened until her nails drew crescents of pain into his palm. Master Thaddeus appeared before them, his face flushed with punch and pleasure. "Enjoying your wedding day, are we?" His voice dripped with false benevolence. He swirled his cup, the poisoned liquid catching the light. He'd drunk at least 4 servings, perhaps more. Enough to kill a horse. "I do hope you appreciate the expense I've gone to. The ceremony, the celebration. It's more than most of your kind ever receive. Your kind. Not people. Not humans. Your kind." "Yes, master," Josiah heard himself say, the words automatic after a lifetime of conditioning. "Thank you, master." Thaddeus smiled, and in that smile, Josiah saw every cruelty visited upon him, every indignity, every moment of powerlessness. He saw his mother's face as she was dragged away. He saw the scars on his back. He saw Delilah's torn dress and empty eyes. "Good boy," Master Thaddeus said, patting Josiah's shoulder like one might pat a dog. Then he drifted away, back into the swirl of guests, his silver hair gleaming, his laughter ringing out above the music. The clock ticked. The storm drew closer. The guests danced and drank and laughed, living their final moments of life with the carefree abandon of the ignorant. 23 minutes since the first toast. The music swelled, a crescendo of strings and piano. Couples whirled across the floor in elaborate patterns, their expensive clothes rustling like leaves before a storm. The punch bowls stood empty now, drained to the dregs. Servants hurried to refill them from the poisoned decanters, ensuring that any latecomer to the festivities would share in the fate of the others. 25 minutes. Octavia Whitmore was lecturing Constance Merrick about proper table settings, her voice sharp and condescending. "In my day, we would never have placed the fish fork on the outside. Standards have declined, Constance." Declined precipitously. Constance nodded absently, her smile frozen on her face, her eyes darting to her husband who was laughing too loudly with Cornelius Blackwell. She finished her 3rd cup of punch and reached for a 4th, perhaps hoping alcohol would numb the knowledge she carried about what her husband did in the darkness of slave quarters. 28 minutes. The first raindrop struck the window with a sound like a gunshot. Then another. Then a deluge, the storm finally breaking, water sheeting against glass and drumming on the roof like the fingers of the dead demanding entry. 29 minutes. And then. Prudence Ashford gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. Her thin face had gone pale as milk, her eyes wide with sudden alarm. She began, but the words caught in her throat. She pressed both hands to her midsection, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin translucent as paper, blue veins visible beneath the surface. "Prudence." Evangeline Blackwell stepped closer, concern flickering across her features. "Are you quite all right?" Prudence tried to answer but instead doubled over, a small moan escaping her lips. "My stomach," she managed, her voice thin and strained. "Such terrible cramping. I feel. The music faltered. Couples stopped dancing. All eyes turned to Prudence Ashford as she straightened with visible effort, one hand gripping a chair for support, the other still pressed to her abdomen. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said, attempting a smile that came out as a grimace. "Perhaps something I ate." But Josiah, watching from the shadows, knew better. The sweetness was over. The dying had begun. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre horror stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, I read them all. The unraveling began with Prudence Ashford's strangled gasp, but it truly commenced when her body expelled the punch in a violent eruption that splattered across the polished floor. She barely made it to the porcelain chamber pot that a servant thrust before her, her thin frame convulsing with the force of her body's desperate attempt to purge the poison that had already entered her bloodstream, already begun its inexorable work. "Good God," Virgil muttered, his own face suddenly pale beneath its permanent flush. He took a step toward his wife, then stopped, one hand pressed to his chest. "I feel, something's not right." The words had barely left his mouth when Evangeline Blackwell went down like a felled tree. She collapsed in the center of the ballroom, her silk dress billowing around her, her body seizing in violent spasms. Her back arched impossibly, her heels drumming against the floor, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. Foam flecked her lips. A sound came from her throat, not quite a scream, not quite a moan, but something animal and terrible that made everyone in the room freeze. "Evangeline." Cornelius dropped to his knees beside his wife, his hands hovering over her convulsing form, unsure where to touch, how to help. "Someone get Dr. Hayes. For God's sake, where's the doctor?" But Dr. Beauregard Hayes was already stumbling, his medical bag falling from nerveless fingers. The combination of laudanum and oleander had hit him like a freight train, his system unable to process either poison effectively. He tried to focus on Evangeline, tried to summon his medical training, but his vision swam and doubled. His heart, he could feel it in his chest, beating erratically, skipping beats, racing and then slowing, a rhythm that made no sense, that shouldn't be possible in a living body. "Poison," he gasped, the word tasting like copper on his tongue. His throat burned as though he'd swallowed acid, the oleander's alkaloids cauterizing tissue, leaving raw chemical burns in their wake. "It's poison. All of us. We've been." He vomited before he could finish, his body rejecting the toxin even as it spread through his organs like wildfire through dry grass. Judge Ambrose Whitmore clutched his chest, his ancient face turning purple, then gray, then blue. His mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. The irregular heartbeat, ventricular tachycardia, if Dr. Hayes had been capable of diagnosing it, made his chest feel like it was being crushed by invisible hands. He tried to call for his sister, but no sound emerged. He simply stood there, swaying, his eyes bulging with incomprehension and terror, before toppling forward like a felled oak. Octavia Whitmore's scream cut through the chaos like a blade. "Ambrose! Ambrose!" She rushed to her brother's side, her black bombazine dress rustling, her sharp tongue for once silent in the face of genuine horror. Chaos erupted like a dam breaking. Silas Pemberton, who had won his drinking contest with Virgil Ashford by consuming 7 cups of poison punch, clawed at his throat. His fingers dug into his own flesh, drawing blood, as if he could physically rip out the burning sensation that consumed him from within. His face had gone the color of raw meat, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He stumbled into a table, sending crystals shattering across the floor, and fell to his hands and knees, retching violently. Mercy Pemberton backed away from her husband, her Bible clutched to her chest like a shield against demons. "The judgment of God," she whispered, her voice rising to a shriek. "The judgment of God is upon us. We are in the presence of divine wrath." Lieutenant Gideon Talmadge tried to maintain military composure even as his vision blurred and doubled. He blinked hard, once, twice, trying to clear his sight, but the world refused to come into focus. Henrietta Vale's face swam before him, her features melting and reforming like candle wax. He reached for her, but his arm moved sluggishly, as though pushing through water. "Can't see," he muttered. "Why can't I see?" Henrietta herself felt the paralysis creeping up from her fingertips, a cold numbness that spread through her hands, her arms, her shoulders. She tried to move, tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She looked down and watched in horror as her own hand twitched and spasmed, the muscles firing randomly, beyond her control. A sound emerged from her throat, a whimper, then a wail, as understanding dawned. She was dying. They were all dying. Dr. Hayes forced himself to his knees, his medical training warring with the poison shutting down his systems. He had to think, had to identify the agent, and had to find a treatment. Cardiac glycosides, the symptoms pointed to cardiac glycosides. Irregular heartbeat, nausea, neurological symptoms, the burning throat. But what plant? What source? His mind raced through possibilities even as his heart stuttered in his chest. Digitalis? No, the onset was too rapid. Lily of the Valley? Possible, but unlikely in South Carolina. Oleander. Oleander. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The sweetness everyone had commented on. The floral, perfume-like quality. It was oleander, Nerium oleander, one of the most poisonous plants in existence. Every part is toxic. Irreversible cardiac damage. No antidote. No treatment. Nothing he could do except watch everyone die, including himself. Oleander, he croaked, his voice barely audible over the screaming and retching. It's oleander in the punch. There's no, he vomited again, the words lost in the violence of his body's revolt. No antidote. God help us. There's no antidote. Constance Merrick heard him. Her face, already pale with shock, went translucent. No, she whispered. Then louder, N.O. Someone help us. Ride for Charleston. Get the doctor. Get help. But the enslaved servants stood frozen, watching the masters who had brutalized them for generations writhe in agony. No one moved to help. No one ran for assistance. They simply stood, bearing witness to something that resembled justice, however terrible its form. Master Thaddeus Merrick, stronger than the others, fought the poison with the same iron will he'd used to build his empire. His heart hammered irregularly in his chest, his throat burned like hellfire, but he remained on his feet through sheer force of fury. His eyes found Josiah across the ballroom, and in them burned the understanding of betrayal. You, he snarled, or tried to, the word came out strangled and wet. You did this. He lurched toward Josiah, his legs unsteady, his hands curled into claws. Murder blazed in his eyes, the rage of a man who had never once been denied what he wanted, who had never encountered resistance that couldn't be beaten or bought. He would kill Josiah with his bare hands, would strangle the life from him before the poison could claim its victory. Josiah stood motionless, watching his master approach. He felt nothing. Not fear, not satisfaction, not even relief. He was hollowed out, an empty vessel, a man who had already died and was simply waiting for his body to catch up with his soul. But Master Thaddeus never reached him. 5 feet away, his heart finally seized. His legs buckled. He crashed to the floor like a falling monument, his silver hair spreading around his head like a tarnished halo. His mouth worked soundlessly, his eyes locked on Josiah, filled with impotent rage and dawning terror as death came for him at last. Delilah's scream cut through the chaos. Not a scream of horror at the dying guests, but a scream of recognition. Her eyes found Josiah's across the carnage, across the writhing bodies and pools of vomit and broken crystal. At that moment, she understood everything. The punch. The poison. The reason no one had offered them any to drink. Josiah, she breathed, her voice barely audible. Oh, Josiah. What have you done? He couldn't answer. What words existed for this? How could he explain that he'd chosen damnation over submission, that he'd decided if he couldn't be free, he could at least be the instrument of justice, however dark and terrible? How could he make her understand that watching Master Thaddeus die was worth his own soul's destruction? She didn't scream again. Didn't condemn. Tears simply rolled down her face in silent rivers as she looked at the man she'd been forced to marry, the man who had poisoned 19 people to avenge her violation. The ballroom had become a vision of hell. Bodies littered the floor in various stages of dying. Virgil Ashford vomited blood, his liver failing under the toxic assault. Rowena Hayes clawed at her arms, hallucinating insects crawling beneath her skin, her nervous system misfiring as it collapsed. Cornelius Blackwell cradled his convulsing wife, sobbing, his own heart beginning its irregular dance toward death. And then the supernatural elements began to emerge, as if the sheer horror of the moment had torn a hole between worlds. In the gilded mirrors that lined the ballroom walls, shadows moved. Not reflections of the dying guests, but other figures, tall and short, young and old, all with the same hollow eyes and slack expressions. The enslaved dead of Bellefonte, drawn by the agony, by the blood price being paid. They watched from the glass, silent witnesses to a reckoning generation in the making. The chandeliers swung though no wind blew. The candles flickered and danced, their flames stretching upward as if trying to escape. The magnolias in their garlands began to brown and wilt, their white petals turning black, dropping to the floor like snow in hell. From somewhere in the empty upper floors, a child's voice began to sing. High and clear and terribly sweet, a morning song in a language older than English, older than slavery itself. An African lament for the dead, for the stolen, for those who would never go home. Mercy Pemberton heard it and her mind broke. She began to laugh, a high, hysterical sound that competed with the moaning of the dying. Angels, she shrieked, pointing at nothing. I hear angels singing. We are saved. God has sent his angels. But they weren't angels. Everyone knew they weren't angels. Lieutenant Talmadge, blind now, his pupils blown wide and unseeing, turned his face toward the sound of the singing. Mother, he called out, his voice cracking. Mother, is that you? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to those children in Florida. Mother, please. His confession was cut short as he collapsed, his body shutting down system by system, organ by organ. The storm outside had reached a crescendo. Rain hammered against the windows like fists demanding entry. Thunder shook the foundations of Bellefonte. Lightning illuminated the ballroom in stark flashes of white light, and in those brief moments of clarity, the shadows in the mirrors seemed to press closer, as if trying to break through the glass. Dr. Hayes, on his hands and knees in a pool of his own vomit, looked up at Josiah. Their eyes met across the dying and the dead. The doctor's face held no anger, no accusation. Only a terrible, weary understanding. Well played, he whispered, blood staining his teeth. Well played, indeed. Then he pitched forward and lay still. Josiah stood in the center of the carnage, Delilah beside him, as the storm raged and the dead watched for mirrors and 19 souls struggled toward their end. He had done this. He had chosen this. And as Master Thaddeus Merrick drew his final, rattling breath, his eyes still fixed on Josiah with impotent fury, Josiah felt something he hadn't expected. Not satisfied. Not guilt. Simply exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of a man who had carried too much for too long and had finally, terribly, set down his burden. The child's voice sang on, weaving through the moans and the thunder, a lament for all of them, the murdered and the murderers, the enslaved and the enslavers, the damned and the dying. The sweetness had curdled. The reckoning had come. And there would be no mercy in it. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre horror stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, I read them all. Death came slowly to Bellefonte, measured not in moments but in hours, 6 hours of agony stretched thin as wire, each minute an eternity of suffering. The storm outside matched the tempest within, rain lashing the windows, wind howling through the eaves like the voices of the damned welcoming new arrivals. Master Thaddeus Merrick took the longest to die. His constitution, strengthened by decades of the finest food and leisure while others labored, fought the poison with stubborn tenacity. He lay on the ballroom floor where he'd fallen, his silver hair matted with sweat and vomit, his pale eyes fixed on the ceiling, or perhaps on something beyond it that only the dying could see. His breathing came in wet, rattling gasps, blood frothing at his lips with each exhale. Constance knelt beside him, her mint-green silk ruined, her carefully arranged hair falling in disarray around her tear-stained face. Hold on, Thaddeus, she whispered, though she knew it was futile. Dr. Hayes had been clear before he died, there was no antidote, no treatment, no hope. Please hold on. But Thaddeus wasn't holding on to life. He was holding on to rage. His eyes found Josiah one final time where he stood against the wall, held there by Cornelius Blackwell and 2 other survivors who had drunk sparingly or not at all. Thaddeus tried to speak, tried to form a curse that would follow Josiah into eternity. His mouth worked, his tongue pushing against teeth stained red with blood. The words came out as nothing more than a gurgle, a wet, choking sound that might have been, damn you, or might have been nothing at all. Then his eyes glazed, the light behind them extinguishing like candles snuffed by an unseen hand. His chest rose once more, fell, and did not rise again. Constance's wail cut through the ballroom, primal and terrible. But there was no time for grief. Too many others were still dying. Judge Ambrose Whitmore went peacefully, mercifully spared the awareness of his own dissolution by the confusion that had plagued his final years. As the poison ravaged his ancient body, his mind retreated to the Revolutionary War, to Valley Forge in the winter of 1778. He lay in Octavia's arms, smiling, his blind eyes seeing snowdrifts that existed only in memory. "General Washington," he murmured, reaching up to touch his sister's face. "Such an honor, sir. Such an honor to serve." His hand fell. His smile remained. He slipped away believing himself a hero, surrounded by patriots rather than dying in a poisoned ballroom in a nation built on stolen freedom. Octavia held him long after he was gone, rocking back and forth, her sharp tongue finally silenced by grief too deep for words. Silas Pemberton's death was not peaceful. The slave trader who had grown fat on human misery spent his final hours begging God for mercy he had never shown others. He crawled across the floor on his hands and knees, his massive body racked with convulsions, his lips moving in desperate prayer. "Forgive me," he whispered, the words tumbling out in broken confession. "The girl in Charleston, she was only 13. I knew. And I sold her anyway to that house, that terrible house. Forgive me. The family I separated in Savannah," the mother jumped from the ship. "I laughed. God help me," I laughed. "Forgive me, please, forgive." His heart seized mid-prayer. He collapsed face first into a pool of his own vomit, his confessions unfinished, his ledger of sins too long to complete before death claimed him. Mercy Pemberton, still alive but broken by madness, sang hymns over his body, her voice cracked and tuneless. Lieutenant Gideon Talmadge died in Henrietta Vale's arms, and it broke something irreparable inside her. He'd been blinded by the poison, his nervous system misfiring, his young body unable to process the toxin's assault. As his heart began its final irregular rhythm, he groped for her hand, found it, held it with the desperation of a drowning man. "I can't see you," he whispered, blood trickling from his nose. "Henrietta, I can't see anything. I'm frightened. I don't want to die. I'm only 29. I was supposed to, we were going to." "Shoo," she soothed, though tears streamed down her face. She'd been calculating his worth only hours before, had seen him as nothing more than a potential source of security and status. Now, holding him as he died, she saw only a young man terrified of the darkness rushing toward him. "I'm here. You're not alone." "The children," he gasped suddenly, his blind eyes moving frantically. "The Seminole children in Florida. We burned their village. They were screaming. God, they were screaming and I. His confession ended in a gurgle. His hand went slack in hers. His chest stilled. Henrietta looked down at the body in her arms and began to laugh. It started as a giggle, high and fragile, then built to hysterical peals that echoed through the ballroom. She laughed and laughed, rocking the corpse like a child with a doll, until her voice gave out and she simply sat there, catatonic, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. The survivors moved through the carnage like ghosts themselves. Constance Merrick, her husband died. Cornelius Blackwell, cradling Evangeline's body. Octavia Whitmore, still holding her brother. Virgil Ashford, who had drunk deeply but possessed a constitution like an ox, vomited continuously but clung to life. Mercy Pemberton, singing her broken hymns. Rowena Hayes, hallucinating demons that clawed at her from the shadows. And a handful of others who had arrived late or declined the punch for various reasons. The slaves did this, Cornelius rasped, his voice raw from vomiting. He pointed a shaking finger at Josiah. "That one. He prepared the punch. He poisoned us. We must hang him immediately." "Yes," Constance agreed, her grief transforming instantly to rage. She needed someone to blame, needed a target for the agony tearing through her. Hang them both. The murderers. Hang them now. But there was no organization left, no structure to impose order on the chaos. More than half the guests lay dead or dying. The enslaved servants had vanished into the storm, fleeing into the night while their masters were too occupied with death to stop them. There was no rope, no scaffold, no will to construct one when so many still moaned and writhed on the ballroom floor. Instead, they dragged Josiah and Delilah to the cellar and locked them in darkness. The cellar was a tomb of earth and stone, damp and cold, smelling of root vegetables and decay. A single candle guttered in a wall sconce, casting dancing shadows that made the walls seem to breathe. Josiah and Delilah sat on the packed dirt floor, their wedding clothes soiled and torn, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Above them, the dying continued their symphony of suffering. Footsteps paced back and forth. Someone wept continuously, a raw, animal sound. The storm hammered at Bellefonte's foundations as if trying to tear the plantation from the earth and cast it into the sea. "Why?" Delilah finally whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the storm and the distant moaning. "Why did you do it, Josiah?" He looked at her in the guttering candlelight. Her face was drawn, exhausted, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "You know why. Tell me anyway. I need to hear you say it." So he told her. Everything. Finding her in the smokehouse 3 nights ago, her dress torn, her spirit shattered. The months of violation she'd endured in silence, the threats Master Thaddeus had made if she resisted or spoke. The marriage that was meant to be entertainment, a cruel jest performed for the amusement of Charleston society. The rage that had been building in him for 27 years, compressed and condensed until it became something dense and terrible as a collapsed star. "I couldn't let it continue," he said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't watch him destroy you and do nothing. I couldn't be powerless anymore. So I chose. I chose damnation over submission. I chose to act rather than endure. If my soul was already forfeit, I would at least make it count for something." Delilah was silent for a long time. Then, "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the darkness between them like a physical thing. "It's his," she continued, her voice flat, emotionless. "Master Thaddeus's child. Not yours. I'm carrying the baby of a man you just murdered. The baby of my rapist." Josiah felt something inside him shatter. He'd known, on some level, that this was possible. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the confirmation, it was a wound deeper than any whip could inflict. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, Delilah, I'm so sorry. Don't be." She looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw not condemnation but a terrible, weary understanding. "You did what I couldn't. You made them pay. Maybe I should thank you. Maybe I should curse you. I don't know anymore. I don't know anything except that I'm carrying a dead man's child and they're going to kill us both when the sun rises." Above them, the dying continued. Someone, it sounded like Virgil Ashford, screamed that he couldn't feel his legs. The paralysis was spreading through whoever remained alive, the oleander's final gift. The storm intensified, if such a thing was possible. Thunder shook the cellar, raining dirt from the ceiling. Lightning illuminated the narrow window slits, brief flashes of white light that turned everything stark and ghostly. Then came a sound that made them both look up, a tremendous crack, followed by an explosion of noise. Lightning had struck somewhere on the property. Through the window slits, they could see an orange glow growing brighter. Fire. One of the slave cabins had been hit, its dry wood igniting instantly despite the rain. The flames spread with terrible speed, leaping from structure to structure, consuming the quarters where enslaved people had lived and suffered and died for generations. The fire painted the night sky orange and red, a funeral pyre for the old order. In the ballroom above, someone noticed. "Fire." The voice was weak, barely audible. "The cabins are burning." But no one had the strength to fight it. Those still alive were too consumed by their own dying to care about fire or flood or the end of the world. They simply lay there, watching their hearts beat their final erratic rhythms, feeling their lungs draw their final breaths. Dr. Beauregard Hayes's body lay near the punch table, his medical bag spilled open beside him, laudanum bottles rolling across the floor. Rowena Hayes had died clutching a handkerchief embroidered with her lover's initials, her last thoughts not of her husband but of a man who would never know she was gone. Mercy Pemberton finally stopped singing. She sat beside her husband's body, her Bible open in her lap, her eyes staring at verses she could no longer read. Her heart stuttered, paused, and did not resume. Virgil Ashford, who had boasted of drinking others under the table, who had made a contest of consuming poison, finally succumbed. His last words were not prayers or confessions but a slurred curse against the rain that hammered endlessly against the windows. Prudence Ashford, his long-suffering wife, had died hours earlier, finally released from a marriage that had been its own form of slavery. One by one, the lights went out. One by one, the voices stilled. One by one, 19 souls slipped into darkness as the storm raged and the fire burned and Bellefonte Plantation died around them. In the cellar, Josiah and Delilah heard the moment when silence fell. It was almost imperceptible, a gradual cessation of sound, the moaning fading to whimpers, the whimpers fading to sighs, the sighs fading to nothing at all. Even the storm seemed to pause, holding its breath. Dawn was coming. They could see it through the window slits, a pale gray light that crept across the sky like an apology, like a promise that the world would continue despite everything that had happened in the darkness. 19 people had entered the ballroom alive. 19 people lay dead as the sun prepared to rise. And in the cellar, 2 people waited for their own execution, surrounded by shadows and silence and the weight of what had been done in the name of justice, in the name of rage, in the name of a freedom that could never truly be theirs. The last victim had expired just before dawn. The long dying was over. Now comes the reckoning. The dawn that broke over Bellefonte Plantation was pale and sickly, the sun rising through layers of smoke and dissipating storm clouds like a jaundiced eye surveying the carnage below. The fire had burned itself out, leaving the slave quarters as charred skeletons, their blackened beams reaching toward heaven like the fingers of the damned. The main house stood intact but transformed, no longer a monument to southern grandeur but a mausoleum holding 19 corpses. They came for Josiah and Delilah as the sun climbed higher, painting the devastated grounds in shades of ash and blood. Constance Merrick unlocked the cellar door herself, her face a mask of controlled fury beneath the ravages of sleeplessness and grief. She had not died, had drunk perhaps half a cup of punch before being called away to supervise some detail of the celebration. That half cup had made her violently ill through the night, but her heart had continued its steady rhythm. She had vomited and cramped and hallucinated, but she had lived. And now, with her husband dead and her world destroyed, she needed vengeance. "Bring them up," she commanded, her voice hoarse but steady. Cornelius Blackwell and 2 other survivors, men whose names Josiah had never learned, whose faces blurred together in the gray morning light, descended into the cellar. They hauled Josiah and Delilah up the stairs roughly, their hands like iron manacles on their arms. Josiah did not resist. What point was there in resistance? He had done what he set out to do. The price had always been clear. The ballroom was a vision of hell in daylight. Bodies lay where they had fallen, covered now with white sheets that were already staining through with the fluids of death. The floor was slick with vomit and blood and the various evacuations of the dying. The magnolias in their garlands had turned completely black, their petals littering the ground like funeral confetti. The stench was overwhelming, the sweet-rot smell of death mingled with the acrid tang of smoke from the burned quarters. Henrietta Vale sat in the corner, still cradling Lieutenant Talmadge's corpse, still making that low keening sound that was not quite laughter and not quite weeping. She did not acknowledge the living. Perhaps, in her fractured mind, there was no difference anymore between the dead and the living. "You will hang for this," Constance said, standing before Josiah with her hands clenched at her sides. "You will hang, and I will watch, and I will smile as you choke." But even as she spoke, Josiah could see the calculation in her eyes. She was thinking beyond vengeance, thinking about what a trial would mean. Questions would be asked. The circumstances would be examined. Newspapers would report the story, 19 members of Charleston society dead at a slave wedding. The details would emerge, Master Thaddeus's particular interest in the bride. The marriage itself, a farce performed for entertainment. The peculiar institution laid bare in all its cruelty and hypocrisy. The abolitionist papers up north would seize on it. The British papers would mock Southern civilization. The careful fiction that slavery was a benevolent institution, that masters were kindly patriarchs caring for childlike charges, would crumble under scrutiny. Cornelius Blackwell understood this too. He stepped forward, his face haggard, his clothes reeking of vomit. "Constance," he said quietly, "we need to consider." "I know what we need to consider," she snapped. Then, more quietly, "I know." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. Finally, Constance spoke again, her voice cold and deliberate. "It was the oysters. From Charleston. They were contaminated. A tragedy, but these things happen. Bad shellfish. The heat. No one's fault, really. Just terrible luck. Josiah felt something like bitter laughter build in his chest. Of course. They would bury the truth along with their dead. They would protect the institution even at the cost of justice for their loved ones. The system was more important than any individual life, even their own. The slaves, Cornelius said carefully, will need to be dealt with. Quietly. Sold away, perhaps. To different plantations, far from here. We can't risk them talking. Constance nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Josiah's face. Separate them. Sell them to plantations at least 500 miles apart. The woman goes to the Rawlings place in Georgia. I believe that was Thaddeus's intention anyway. The man to Louisiana, perhaps. The sugar fields. I hear the life expectancy there is quite short. It was a death sentence delivered with a smile. Separation and slow destruction, legal and complete. No trial, no publicity, no threat to the institution. Just two slaves vanishing into the vast machine of Southern slavery, ground to dust between its gears. Delilah's hand found Josiah's. Her grip was tight enough to hurt. He squeezed back, trying to communicate everything he could not say, his love, his sorrow, his regret that his vengeance had not included their escape, their freedom, their future together. They were separated that afternoon. Josiah was loaded into a wagon bound for New Orleans, his hands bound, his future sold to a sugar plantation where men died by the hundreds from heat and exhaustion and disease. Delilah was taken in the opposite direction, toward Georgia and the Rawlings plantation, where difficult women were sent to be broken. They did not say goodbye. There were no words adequate for what had happened, for what had been lost, for what could never be recovered. As the wagon carried him away from Bellefonte, Josiah looked back once. The plantation house stood against the gray sky, beautiful and terrible, surrounded by the charred remains of the slave quarters. Smoke still rose from the ruins. And in the upper windows, he thought he saw figures watching, not the living, but others. Shadows. The dead who had always been there, waiting. Louisiana was hell rendered in heat and sugarcane. Josiah survived 3 years at the Beaumont sugar plantation, though survived was perhaps too generous a word for what he did. He existed. He labored from dawn until darkness, cutting cane that grew 12 feet high and sliced like razors. He watched men die beside him, from exhaustion, from infected wounds, from the fevers that swept through the quarters like divine judgment. He heard their prayers and their curses and their final rattling breaths, and he thought of the 19 people who had died at Bellefonte. He never learned what became of Delilah. Sometimes he imagined she had escaped, had somehow made it to freedom up north. Sometimes he imagined she had died giving birth to Master Thaddeus's child, finally released from suffering. Sometimes he couldn't bear to imagine anything at all. In the fall of 1839, yellow fever came to the Beaumont plantation. It moved through the quarters like fire, leaving bloated corpses in its wake. Josiah welcomed it when his turn came, the fever, the chills, the black vomit that gave the disease its name. He lay in his cabin as his body broke down, and in his delirium, he saw the ballroom at Bellefonte again. The magnolias dripping from chandeliers. The crystal punch bowls gleaming in candlelight. The faces of the damned raised their glasses in toast. His last word was, Delilah. He died believing she was lost to him forever, that his vengeance had destroyed the only person he'd ever loved, that he had traded her life for his rage and gained nothing but damnation. He was wrong, but he would never know it. Bellefonte Plantation fell into decay with remarkable speed. Constance tried to maintain it for a year after the massacre, but the house was haunted, not metaphorically, but genuinely, undeniably haunted. Servants refused to enter the ballroom. Those who did reported seeing figures dancing in the mirrors, hearing music from empty rooms, smelling magnolias blooming in winter. Constance herself woke repeatedly to find Master Thaddeus standing at the foot of her bed, his mouth working soundlessly, blood frothing at his lips. She sold the property at a loss in 1838 and moved to Charleston, where she lived as a recluse until her death in 1851. She never remarried. She never spoke of that day in April. When she died, her servants reported that her last words were an apology to someone who wasn't there. The new owners of Bellefonte lasted 6 months before fleeing. The ones after them, 3. The plantation passed through a dozen hands before the Civil War, each owner driven away by the same phenomena, the dancing shadows, the phantom music, the smell of oleander and death that permeated the ballroom no matter how thoroughly it was cleaned. During the war, Union troops used Bellefonte as a temporary headquarters. They burned it to the ground when they moved on, whether under orders or for other reasons, no one could say. But the soldiers who set the fire reported seeing figures in the windows as the flames consumed the house, not fleeing, not screaming, but dancing. Always dancing. Local legend claimed that on the anniversary of the massacre, you could still hear music drifting across the abandoned property. Waltz music, faint and distant, accompanied by the clink of crystal and the murmur of conversation. And if you looked into the overgrown ruins on April 18th, you might see shadows moving through the ballroom that no longer existed, performing an eternal celebration that had become an eternal damnation. Delilah survived. Against all odds, against all expectations, she survived the Rawlings plantation, survived childbirth, survived the war, and lived to see emancipation. The child, a girl, was born in the winter of 1837 and died of fever before her first birthday. Perhaps it was a mercy. Delilah never spoke of the father, never acknowledged who had violated her, never revealed what had truly happened at Bellefonte. When freedom came, she took the name Delilah Freeman and moved to Charleston, where she worked as a seamstress and lived in a small room above a bakery. She never married. She spoke rarely and smiled less. But once a year, on April 18th, she would travel to the ruins of Bellefonte Plantation. She would stand at the edge of the overgrown cemetery where the Merricks family was buried, and she would place a single magnolia blossom on Master Thaddeus's headstone. Not as a tribute. Not as forgiveness. But as a reminder. As a testament. As proof that she had survived when he had not, that she had outlived him, that his final attempt to destroy her had failed. The magnolias grew wild in the ruins, beautiful and white, their roots spreading through the ground where bodies were buried, drawing nutrients from the decay, transforming death into life. They bloomed every spring without fail, indifferent to human suffering, unconcerned with justice or vengeance or the weight of history. And in the cemetery, oleander grew too. No one knew who had planted it, perhaps no one had, perhaps it had simply appeared, drawn by the blood spilled in its name. It wound through the headstones like a serpent, its pink blossoms lovely and lethal, a living monument to the horror of 1836. Delilah lived until 1889, dying at the age of 75 in a Charleston hospital with her hand held by a young black nurse who had never known slavery, who had been born into freedom that Delilah's generation had bled for. Her last words, recorded by that nurse, were, "Tell Josiah I understand. Tell him I forgive him. Tell him I survived." But there was no Josiah to tell. He had been dead for 50 years, buried in an unmarked grave in Louisiana, his name forgotten, his story lost. Or so everyone believed. The ruins of Bellefonte Plantation still stand, a century and a half later. The ballroom is open to the sky now, its roof long since collapsed, its walls crumbling. Vines have reclaimed the space, winding through broken windows, pulling down what remains of the structure. The cemetery is overgrown, the headstones tilted and worn, the names barely legible. But the magnolias still bloom. The oleander still grows, sprawling over graves, its flowers pink and perfect and poisonous. And on April 18th of every year, visitors report strange phenomena. The smell of punch, rum and brandy and citrus and something floral. The sound of music, a waltz from the 1830s, played on instruments that no longer exist. The sight of shadows in the ruins, moving through the ghost of a ballroom, raising ghost glasses in eternal toast. And sometimes, just at dawn, the figure of a woman in white placing a magnolia blossom on a particular grave. She appears for only a moment, solid as life, before fading like morning mist. Some say it's Delilah's ghost, still keeping her annual vigil. Others say it's something else, a memory so strong it has imprinted itself on the land, playing out again and again like a film stuck on repeat. The locals avoid Bellefonte. They don't picnic on the grounds or let their children play in the ruins. They know the stories, passed down through generations, stories of poison punch and mass death, of slavery's cruelty and one man's terrible vengeance, of ghosts that dance forever in a ballroom that no longer exists. The historical marker erected in 1976 tells a sanitized version of events, site of Bellefonte Plantation, built 1789. Home of the Merricks family until 1837. 19 people died here on April 18, 1836, from contaminated food during a wedding celebration. The plantation was burned by Union forces in 1863. Now a protected historical site. Contaminated food. The lie persisted even in official history. But the truth is there for those who know how to look. It's in the oleander that grows too abundantly to be natural. It's in the magnolias that bloom with almost aggressive vitality. It's in the shadows that move when they shouldn't, in the music that plays when no one is there to perform it, in the smell of poison that lingers in the air on still summer evenings. Bellefonte remembers. The dead remember. And once a year, a woman in white reminds them all that some debts can never be fully paid, that some ghosts can never be laid to rest, that the past is not past but present, breathing, alive in the ruins and the roots and the flowers that bloom beautiful and deadly over the graves of the damned. The magnolia blossom sits on Master Thaddeus Merricks' headstone, white against the grey stone, perfect and ephemeral. By evening, it will have browned and wilted. By morning, it will be gone. But next year, on April 18th, another will appear. And the year after that. And the year after that. Forever. Because some stories don't end. They just keep telling themselves, over and over, a warning and a remembrance and a testament to what happens when human beings are treated as property, when cruelty is sanctioned by law, when the only path to justice is through damnation. The sun sets over the ruins of Bellefonte Plantation. The shadows lengthen. The oleander sways in the breeze, its pink blossoms nodding like the heads of those who understand the price of beauty, the cost of revenge, the weight of history that can never be lifted, only carried. And in the ruins of the ballroom, if you listen carefully, you can still hear it, the clink of crystal, the murmur of voices, the waltz playing on and on and on into eternity. The sweetness before. The horror after. The haunting forever. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre horror stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, I read them all.